Hello everyone. Today we're going to discuss the decline of the idea of the state, which is the first essay from Evola's Metaphysics of Power. We'll be working from the Arctos edition, which is an absolutely gorgeous book, and I highly recommend that you pick up a copy and read through it yourself. Now, at the heart of this essay, we have what you might call a perennial perspective on politics, derived from Evola's study of both Occidental and Oriental traditions. And what he says is that many varied and apparently unrelated phenomena in the modern world can be explained by a single process, which evades the comprehension of the contemporary mind for the most part. Evola calls this the cycle of involution and claims that it's been recognized and encoded in many traditions throughout history. Okay, so let's have a look at the outline of this presentation. We're going to explore the core concept of involution, which is the regression of political authority through the, quote, social quadripartition, this being the division of the state into four principal castes. Those are the peasant, the merchant, the warrior, and the priest. Starting at the base, we will ascend through the caste, describing each one in turn. Then we shall follow the process of involution back down, describing the decline of the idea of the state as we go. Finally, we will conclude with some remarks about what it means to live in the present moment and how this relates to the concept of involution. And I'll say at the outset that this is a personal view. I'm not going to adhere to strict academic conventions of referencing and quotation. I'll largely be paraphrasing and adding my own bits of analysis in as we go. But before we get started, we're going to talk about Zen gardening. Okay, this is a little analogy, a little example, which I think will help us to understand what Evola's talking about as we get into the more abstract and technical political stuff. So at the heart of Zen gardening is, I think, the yin-yang symbol itself, this idea that reality has this paradoxical character. It is composed of a non-material, essential, formal component, and then on the other hand, a material, substantive component. And within the practice of Zen gardening, we have a blank tray of sand. We start off with complete absence of form, just the substance of the sand represented. And then the meditation begins with the practitioner using a small rake to draw an increasingly complex geometric pattern into the sand. So we have this build-up of forms onto the substance, which is then eventually washed away once the creation is complete, to leave us once again with the raw substance of the sand. And another element of this is the idea that the four elements, shall we say, should be kept in balance within Zen gardening. So I've included here the four alchemical symbols for the four elements, those of air, fire, water, and earth. And this entire process, as I said, I think gives us a good idea of what Evola's talking about. He doesn't actually use this example himself. This is my own example. That we're going to see form rising and falling in substance. And we're going to see these four elements, which I'm going to use to represent the four principal castes. Political authority moving through them as these forms rise and fall. Okay, so involution, what Evola calls regression of the caste. It goes as follows. Civilization is composed of four principal castes. Over time, political authority descends through the caste. This cycle is characterized by four distinct ages. Each age is defined by the nature of the caste which holds political authority within it. And I think there's an interesting crossover here between Evola and Carl Schmitt. What Schmitt says is that the sovereign refers to itself alone. And he's using this is a technical idea that says that the sovereign, the seat of ultimate political authority within a social organism, only refers to itself. It isn't bound by any external laws because it makes the laws. And crucially, the sovereign decides when the laws don't apply. It makes the exception. So this is a technical sense in which the sovereign refers to itself alone. For Evola, there's a kind of spiritual aspect to this as well. insofar as each age is defined by the nature of the caste which holds political authority within it. That age, ultimately, is the sovereign referring to itself and referring to its own qualities and its own characteristics. So, for example, in the age of the merchants, everything becomes mercantile. Everything becomes about money and material and the transmission of various exchanges through a largely unconscious sort of social organism. This is what Evola is saying here. And ultimately, as we see political authority descending through the caste, we have a process of decadence and decomposition in which the lower is derived from the higher. Now, actually, when we look at this process, it kind of, from the modern mind, sounds good, right? It sounds like progress. This is what we're striving for. The idea of political authority descending down to the bottom, power to the people, right? This is what the sort of collective mythology of the modern age says. Power should be held by those at the bottom. But Evola thinks that this is a kind of collective psychic hallucination that we're experiencing here. There are obviously lots of problems in the modern world still. It's kind of embarrassing that it hasn't worked out as it's supposed to have. We're not suffering teething problems and on the verge of a liberal utopia. This is actually us misidentifying decay for progress, right? This process of decay, which is out of our hands, out of our control. We think that we're deliberately moving towards this thing. And so Evola thinks that this is a sort of, as I said, a sort of psychic hallucination, which doesn't bear any correspondence to actual reality. The social quadripartition. This says that there are 4 levels of being, each representing an organic function within the whole. You could imagine within again, the modern mind, the idea that there are 4 castes is a slightly controversial idea. But there's a sense in which we can see them as different things, which are kind of just, horizontally distinct entities. Evola says this is not the case. These are integrated on the y-axis. This is the phrase he uses. So the capabilities of the lower castes are fundamentally integrated in the higher castes as we go up. So the merchant integrates the peasant, the warrior integrates the merchant and the peasant, and the divine king, the phrase that he uses to describe the priests in his system, integrates all of the other 3. And we end up with an organic whole, each of these castes representing an organic function. But these functions are leveled rather than just different functions on a horizontal axis. They're on the y-axis. Another principle here is as above, so below. So the social structure resembles the individuals which compose it, and vice versa. And the ultimate expression is in the divine king, the monarch at the top, this single individual who is the ultimate expression of individuation and self-realization. When you have political authority in the hands of the monarch, the divine king, the entire structure takes on this character and is at its most realized and individuated. And in another sense, we use the example of the merchants. When the merchants have power, everyone is conditioned by the merchants. So the individuals take on mercantile characteristics as well. And even if you find yourself out of step with it, as I imagine most of the people listening to this presentation will do, you still exist as an opponent within the frame of the mercantile age. You oppose it. You're not free to express yourself totally as you would be if you were of a higher spiritual caste and existing within your own time. You still are within the frame of the merchants. So something that is interesting to look at this is to say that it's dynamic. It's neither a fixed caste system nor a state of individual freedom, which are the 2 kind of opposed poles that we set up in the modern world. The idea that you either have this rigid fixed caste system or everyone's free to do what they want. In this system, political authority moves down through the caste, constantly in a state of flux and cycles. And there are obviously, they're not uniform blobs. There are caste within caste. There are levels to warriors. There are levels to merchants. There are levels to peasants. And there are cycles within cycles. There are moments of restorative action, which is something he hints at the potential of in a later essay in the book. But crucially, from the perspective of Evola, his position finds its home at the apex, in the most complete and integrated expression of being, whilst evolutionistic, progressive thinking finds its home at the base, in the multitude of undifferentiated particles and cells and so on and so forth. So the modern idea is that everything starts off with the most simple possible entities, and then through some process, these become more complex and more sophisticated. But we talk about fundamental particles, right? And the fundament literally is the bottom. That is the definition of that word. So you start with the most simple atomized state, and you move towards the most unified and complete state. And there are obviously some problems with this. If you think about the idea of natural selection, it doesn't necessarily tend towards more complex and sophisticated entities. It's just whatever is better at replicating is the thing that survives. So there's been 5 mass extinction events, right, in the past. And we have this kind of Goldilocks theory of mass extinction events where 4 is too few because that wouldn't have led to humans necessarily, and 6 is too many because that's the end of humans, right? We've kind of evolved up to this perfect level of sophistication, and now we're going to just stop everything from changing forever, and that will be the permanent stasis, the permanent utopia. Evola starts in the other, right at the top, right, and departs from the top. The most complete thing comes into existence, and then it decays over time. So a total inversion, again, of the modern way of thinking. Right, our first cast, the peasant. Pure vitality is the function in the organic whole that Evola gives to the peasant. And as I said, I'm using these alchemical symbols to relate to the 4 castes. This is the way of earth, the peasant. And if we refer back to the alchemical symbol for earth, we have an upside down equilateral triangle, which the point of which at the bottom appears to be penetrating through some kind of threshold, right? That's what it looks like. There's a bar that the triangle is piercing through. And I think this is it. The peasant is the closest to substance, if we look back at our example of Zen gardening. And so the symbol for the peasant, for the earth, is this penetration into the domain of pure substance. This is what the peasant does. So these are the agricultural, commercial workers who follow ideals of duty, service, labour, and they have an intimate physical relationship with reality. They live a pre-personal, naturalistic life. The undifferentiated masses, intent on merely living. Fecund, affluent, and reactive. A member of the crowd. Something instinctive and unpredictable which subsumes individuality and yearns for direction. So if we think about substance is everywhere all the time, but it must have a form. It needs a form to be imposed upon it in order for it to be actually realized. Whereas the forms are everywhere and nowhere all the time, but they must have a substance to be manifested in. So the peasant, being so close to substance, is in this unpredictable state, a sort of flashing, flowing of forms, and basically yearning for direction from the essential pole, the opposite pole represented by the yin-yang symbol. This is the way of the peasant, the way of earth. So the peasant represents the most chaotic and peripheral forces, the undifferentiated energies of pure vitality. His tempo is set by nature, and he plants his crops as the seasons dictate. Natural disasters, the vicissitudes of capital, he experiences these phenomena face on, largely unprepared and with innate resilience. Next up, we have the merchant, who represents vital exchanges, and I have ascribed to the merchant the way of water. This is the urban industrial bourgeoisie, the technical experts, organisers of work. They follow the ascesis of capitalism. Very interesting phrase that Evola uses, almost like the reduction of everything down to this transfer of vital exchanges as a kind of ascesis, something which you'd normally think of ascesis as something as a spiritual pursuit, but the merchant has a kind of ascesis of capitalism. He sees profit as a sign of divine favour, science as a path to knowledge and further productive exploitation. So the merchant represents process, technique, homeostasis, the management of vital exchanges and the organic economy. And this idea of liquid capital flowing around the system is very much why I think the way of water is such an appropriate analogy for the merchant, right? He coordinates the vital exchanges of the peasants and arrives at a vegetative form of life, the subconscious existence of a well-run system. The merchant cannot exist alone without someone to do the work he organises, and he cannot conceive of a higher principle beyond the organisation of work. And so we can see now some of the things we said right at the beginning about the ideas of the modern world being out of step with this cycle of tradition. The merchant here, organizing the peasant, is trying to arrive at this kind of static system of permanent management. That's the ideal. And that's so much of that informs our worldview today. It's very hard for us to escape that way of thinking. As I said, you constantly exist within the frame of reference of the sovereign at the time. I think it's fair to say that Evola says this as well. We're at a point of transition between the merchants and the peasants. Okay, the warrior, lex animata in terris, the way of fire. Lex animata in terris, it translates to the living law on earth. So the idea that the individual here is his own law on earth. And we can see now, we said that these different castes have a different organic role within the whole. So you have the raw vitality of the peasant, organized in a kind of dull, vegetative fashion by the vital exchanges of the merchant. Then you arrive at the warrior, this actual conscious organism which is able to direct itself as a discrete individual. This is what the warrior does. This is the way of fire. So this is the warrior aristocracy, the artist, the martial artist, the ideals of heroism and obedience before a legitimate spiritual authority, the establishment of a dignifying path of service to the lower caste. So his will, his ability to move independently, right? This provides a sort of pathway for the lower caste to fit into something meaningful, something which has direction, rather than just to be stuck in this kind of dull stasis that is so suffocating in the modern world. The warrior represents will, movement, direction of the whole, fidelity to one's inner nature, virility, technique honed through hours of training, precise instinct in the moment, a distaste for mundane work. Something that occurred to me when I was creating this was the idea that if you meet a peasant, right, you ask him where he's from, right? This will be an incredibly important anchor for his self-identity. Like if you ask a peasant where he's from, he'll tell you all about it, right? Very, very interested in it. But if you say that to a merchant, this will be seen as kind of parochial and something a bit gauche. If you ask a merchant what his job is, he'll be delighted to tell you all about his job, right? The warrior has a distaste for mundane work. So you're more likely to ask a warrior who he is, and you'll see his eyes light up, and he'll explain all these disciplines he's imposing on himself to become this thing. You're not like an artist is fully committed to his work in the same way that a martial artist is, or a true warrior from the ancient world, should we say. There's this active overcoming of human limits, and also, crucially, the honourable death in the pursuit of that which exceeds mortal boundaries. So the warrior ultimately has to obtain a good death. He can't just fade away. He can't just carry on forever. You see this in the samurai tradition. They're either supposed to die in battle, largely, or to achieve a sort of honourable suicide through the seppuku. In order for the warrior to complete this idea of total completion, the warrior has to die well. So he isn't around to witness the full glory of his achievement. And that's why I think the way of fire is such an appropriate analogy for the warrior. The flame is lit. The flame burns as intently as it can with the fuel available, and then ultimately the flame goes out. And this is the spirit of the warrior, I think, very well described by this alchemical element of fire. So this ability this necessity of like sacrificing oneself means that the warrior is the first spiritual caste. The energy of the peasant, organized by the merchant, directed towards a higher principle as a whole. And at the top, the monarch. This is the name that Evola gives to the priest caste, and this will become apparent later on why. But, well, I mean, actually, this idea of integration, right? The monarch is not just, this will come up later, but the monarch is not just a priest. The monarch integrates all the prior levels. So he is also virile. He is also a warrior who has this kind of divine characteristic, which is why I've chosen this painting. I think it's an extraordinary painting in the National Gallery. I think it's Michael banishing the devil or something like that. But yeah, you can see in this image, it's different from a lot of the other sacred artwork in the National Gallery. This is a virile and also sacred character doing his business. So individuation, the way of air. This is the most important thing for the monarch. We're not just a single discrete organism. We're also individuated. We are unique. This is the most important thing. This is what is ultimately sacred to Evola. We were talking about the Zen Gardening earlier on, about this domain of forms. What makes something unique is the unique assembly of forms that composes it, and it can only be itself. It can be nothing else, and nothing else can be it. This is what we mean by individuation, by differentiation. And the monarch, as a singular figure, achieves this. So these are the divine kings, Rex, the regal monarch, possessing a natural authority derived from an upward focus, the projection of power upwards from the top, at once king and priest. So this is a big hobby horse of mine, the idea of power being directed upwards from the top, and we'll speak about this later on. Normally people talk about power coming downwards, but that is, I think, as we'll see, part of the spiritual circumstances we find ourselves in. The monarch directs power upwards from the top. The monarch is a mirror of the peasant, who is almost rooted in substance. The monarch is a bridge to the supernatural domain of essence. And again, if we refer back to the alchemical element for air, which represents the monarch, we see again this implication of something transgressing a boundary, but upwards this time instead of downwards. The peasant transcends downwards into the domain of pure substance. The monarch transcends upwards into the domain of pure essence. And we have symmetry, a harmonic loop between the top and the bottom of the arrangement. And it's no surprise that there is often a very, very tight bond between the monarchs and the peasants within a sort of healthy operating structure like this. So the monarch represents purity of form and order, manifestation of the intellect, the individuated, unconditioned mind. So this idea that the intellect is not just conformity to some kind of universal abstract truth. The idea that the intellect is a unique expression of the mind. This, again, is something that the monarch represents through his transcendence into the world of forms. These forms are represented on the mental level as well as the physical level. So we have here wholeness of human being, and as we said, as above, so below, wholeness of state at the same time. Both sacred and virile, the monarch integrates all of the subordinate castes. He is the focus from which the unique character of the entire structure is derived. This feat of individuation is what anoints him. So critically, what makes the priest is this individuation. He's not anointed by some abstract entity, some kind of absent god. It is by corresponding so authentically, by finding his own inner nature and being loyal to it, that the priest is truly anointed. And he is given the name the monarch rather than a priest, as we will see in a moment. So the age of the monarch, we can call the golden age. This is one of the examples that Evola uses for his traditional reference points, is Hesiod's 4 ages of man, the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, and the iron age. And I think there's a couple of other ones in there which aren't related to metals. He has a couple of intermediate stages. And similarly, the Hindu tradition has the 4 yugas, with, again, this decomposing cycle from the most complete to the most atomized and incomplete. But in the golden age, political authority sits at the apex of a fully integrated hierarchy. Power is regal and effortless. It is super virile. It's virile and above. It is also sacred. The social system resembles a coherent organism, specifically the regent himself, who is a microcosm of the structure, fully integrated, individuated, and superpersonal at the apex. The warriors recognize and serve the legitimate spiritual authority. They will die to protect it. The merchants manage the organic economy in a holistic and balanced manner, guided by the obedience of the warriors. The peasants are provided with a path of service. The undifferentiated energies of pure vitality are contained within a dignified, ordered form. And I think it's important here to pause, because for the modern mind, the idea of this hierarchical structure is quite challenging, regardless of, how based you think you are or whatever. Like, there is still a twinge of guilt at this idea that the peasants are at the bottom, right? But you see how badly they're treated now. You see in Britain there's some appalling things going on, and we don't need to go into it, but some really, really terrible governance and some people really, really suffering in the most obscene ways imaginable because of the lack of quality of leadership above them. The mercantile leadership is just, is as I said, we don't need to go into it. So the golden age is the age in which all of these higher structures are being projected upwards, and there is a path of service for everyone to fit into. Evola claims that this is superior to the situation we have at the moment, and given what's happening, it's very hard to argue with him. And I think of this idea that cathedrals were built by illiterate peasants, which is, I think, somewhat exaggerated. There were obviously a very sophisticated building operation, not just cathedrals, but the other monumental feats of architecture that have occurred through history. But certainly, it's not the case that everyone was trained in mathematics. There were no standard units, and heuristic manual engineering techniques were used to create these things. Fractal repetitions of forms, much like the music which was composed to be played within these incredible structures. And when you compare them to today's monstrosities, which could only be conceived by, overeducated technical experts, we see this lack of integration and form. What we have is a hypertrophy at the lower levels. This is a phrase that Evola uses. These structures reflect the mercantile spirit, and they instantly fall into decay and disorder because they're not integrated. They don't have this security of form integrated through the levels. And these cathedrals still stand today. Many of them do. But, the proof is in the pudding, right? Some of these beautiful buildings are still standing, whereas things which are built today just collapse instantly. But if an illiterate group of peasants attempted to build a cathedral now, then the technical experts would prevent it. Whereas in the past, we found a bridge to eternity the peasants found a bridge to eternity through their participation in monumental architecture. And many of the examples stand to this day and have done for thousands of years. Another way of thinking about this is the stained glass windows, which were installed into these cathedrals. In the past, they were protected by this natural authority that Evola talks about, this effortless authority of the higher forms, whereas today they're covered with cages. Authority has ceased to be regal and effortless. It has decayed to the point where ugly temporal protection is required. Okay, let's see how it all falls apart. The first stage of involution is the age of priests. The first fracture at the apex, Evola says. So, as he said, these things collapse from the top down, right? So 9/11 truthers get wrecked. This is something that's going to collapse from the top down. So in the age of priests, a purely sacred power is elevated. After Christ, no man can be at the same time king and priest. So here we have instantly a conflict with what Evola was saying about the monarch being king and priest. And there is a lot of conflict between Evola and certain factions of modern Christianity. If you take this universal concept of Christianity, which says that Christ is king and everyone on earth should be Christian, this is at odds with what Evola is saying. Evola is saying that there should be a representative on earth. And also, he hints at a kind of virile imperial Christianity, which is exclusively for the Europeans. Like, we abandon the idea of everyone being Christian. He is a perennialist ultimately. He's happy for other people to take on their own ways of being and for us to keep our own things together. So for the Christian, you have to decide if this is heretical, this way of thinking, or wrong. But something that occurred to me is the doctrine of the second coming when I was thinking about this. And obviously, were Jesus to come back, which I think is something that most Christians would welcome open arms, he would be declared at once king and priest. And so could this be seen as an example of Evola's ultimate monarch appearing on earth? Something to think about, slightly outside of the boundaries of this discussion. But, as Evola says, in the age of priests, an absent monarch is worshipped, and the amputation creates a supermundane order. Abstract ideals reign over a material political reality dominated by the vegetative functions of the lower caste. The shepherd tends his flock. So he's describing a kind of herbivorous form of Christianity, which has lost the virile aspect of the warrior. This has been amputated, and the resulting structure is less vigorous. It loses the functions of the warrior, this kind of independent action of the one. The living law on earth is kind of seen as a bad thing all of a sudden. So we have the first separation of church and state, which again was something that occurred to me when I was thinking about this. We're familiar with the modern separation of church and state, which is seen as a progressive, like a good thing that's happened from the modern perspective, insofar as political authority has been removed from the church, and the church is given a kind of abstract spiritual authority to reign over, but the real power is taken from it. In this instance, the church and the state have been separated, but the church has been subordinated to the state. Natural virile authority has been abandoned. The second separation of church and state sees the authority being completely, or the church being subordinated to the state. So this happens later on. And ultimately, this first act of decadence or hubris from the priest will eventually lead to this second separation of church and state, amongst other things. Okay, the Age of Warriors, the Titanic Retaliation, the Promethean Rebellion, many different sort of exciting sounding names we can give this. But the warriors seize temporal power. They surrender supernatural authority in an attempt to usurp the priest. Power is virile but desanctified. The abandonment of the sacred is the second act of decadence and the second act of hubris. So the warriors seek to retake control, and having seen have the first amputation having happened, the warriors' solution is to desanctify everything and just use pure temporal force to take control. All spiritual distinctions between the sovereign and the various feudal princes evaporate. He allies himself with the merchants and supports their demands against his rivals in the nobility. So without this sacred character to power, there is just now temporal power. There are no distinctions between castes anymore. It's just who can have the most power and who can enact it. And I think the image I've chosen of Prometheus is obviously Evola uses the phrase Promethean, but it is a very appropriate way of looking at this. Prometheus steals fire from the gods and gives it to the men, gives it to humans. And we end up with this fire, which was previously divine, now having a purely temporal environment in which to work. And appropriately enough, Prometheus finds himself bound to a rock, like literally bound to the earth, every day having his liver pecked out by a vulture, I think. And this is symbolic of what has happened to power now that it's been desanctified. And ultimately, absolutism and centralization define the introduction of a national system. So we have this kind of temporal political structure of the nation overtaking the more sacred imperial structures which preceded it. The Age of Merchants, the rebellion of the commons. The nationalist revolution unseats the monarch, often retaining him as an empty symbol. An age of trickery, what Evola refers to elsewhere as demonic possession by the economy. And he literally means this, right? Because he sees this as the lower levels, the Age of Merchants being in the sort of realm of the material, where the demons operate in the realm of the material, and they literally possess the economy. Literally possesses people. They have this hypertrophy at the lower levels, and everything becomes about the material. So we've just been through this Titanic rebellion, this age of warlords. If you think of, we used the samurai example earlier on, but the Sengoku period in Japan with these rival warlords fighting each other, or the Second World War with, FDR, the disgruntled painter, Stalin, Churchill, Mussolini, etc. You have these warlords fighting each other, and eventually they are, once the war is concluded, shall we say, and the commons has produced all this war material, the merchants are able to seize power. Obviously, there's no spiritual distinction between the warriors and the merchants anymore. That's all been abandoned. So there's no reason why the merchants shouldn't take power. If they can do it, they will, and they use trickery to do so. Natural authority gives way to a written constitution. This imposes a social contract. A capitalist oligarchy controls political reality, and the economy dominates all things. So this is what he's saying, demonic possession by the economy. The economy just takes everything over. There is nothing else but the economy. It is an age of merchants. The vital exchanges controls everything. That anything above that is inconceivable or stupid or dangerous. We shouldn't do that. All we should do is the economy. And we have this idea of a constitution, which is kind of ironic because it's an abstraction, right? It's just some stuff written down on a piece of paper. The prior constitution was within the body and the spirit of the natural authority, the warriors, the monarchs, right? They had an actual constitution of a spiritual and virile nature. But now we just have some stuff written down on a piece of paper, which has this paradoxical existence where it's both final and constantly under renegotiation, right? This is the age of the contract devils, the age of trickery, the age of language controlling everything. The third act of decadence is the revocation of the ancient privileges, which are replaced with a system of universal rights. Though a sense of the individual remains, he is defined by his function in an entirely mundane system, the ascesis of capitalism, once again. So this is seen as an incredibly kind of progressive thing, this idea of writing things down, of writing a constitution down, of replacing natural authority with the constitution. But eventually it leads to its own collapse, and we have the age of peasants, the proletarian revolt. The nation is abolished. All remaining spiritual distinctions collapse. A universal brotherhood is imagined, the nation of man. Humanity becomes the object of religion, with God as the enemy. Work and service form the basis of prestige. Culture and spirit become the servile organs of the collective temporal body, no longer active paths of elevation into the supernatural realm. There exists a hatred of higher forms, to which obedience was previously justified and sacred. We witness disintegration into pre-personal collective forms of life, a uniform existence for the anonymous masses. Suspicion of human interiority and the death of privacy herald the fourth act of decadence, the abandonment of a particular way of life. So we reduce down to these raw vital energies of the peasant now. Nothing else is able to contain these in any kind of integrated form. It literally just becomes service to this temporal body. And in this regard, there's no reason why anyone should have anything for themselves. Like, why should anyone have their own way of being at all? You are just a servant to the body. The idea of having your own ideas, for example, this is completely outrageous. And we see that, as it said, the death of human interiority and privacy, all of these things are abandoned. And Evola says that we are at the point of transition between the age of the merchants and the age of peasants. He uses the kind of the Soviet, or the early Soviet slave rebellion, the ethnic slave rebellion of the Soviet Union as his example. We're in an age where things like this are starting to happen. And so he thinks we'll see more and more of these things happening in the future. Okay, so how does this relate to the process of involution as a whole? So we live in a time of inversion. Nothing in this world exists without its opposite. So we think that we've escaped this kind of regressive idea of caste structures and authoritarian power from above. We say that's wrong. We have this other thing, which is the complete opposite of that. But as we saw from the yin yang symbol, there is always two poles to being, and the oscillation between these poles creates the cycles which we observe in nature and in the world. So the age of rejection of the cycles is actually a part of the cycles. This is where we live at the moment. This is why we're having a collective psychic hallucination, because we believe we've escaped the cycle when actually we're just fulfilling an essential part of it. And all these previous traditions which encoded this story into their practices, right? At some point they all forgot it as well, right? Because all of these empires have fallen, and so will our empire, our social structure will fall. Denial of the cycle is part of the cycle. Progress is regress. As we said, we've misinterpreted this regressive sequence of decompositions as a planned bit of progress towards a desired goal, when actually it's completely out of our hands. The attempt to arrive at a utopian stasis merely ensures that the cycle will begin again, because stasis is the most chaotic condition. As we said with our example of Zen gardening, the blank sand yearns for form to be imposed upon it. So for us to bring ourselves down to this point when nothing ever happens ever again, this just ensures that something will happen within these traditional doctrines of cycles and so on and so forth. The most chaotic possible thing that one can do is to try and create a permanent stasis. So the modern condition, twilight of the contract devils, as we said, the boundary between the age of the merchants and the age of the peasants. The king, the archbishop, and the soldier, all marionettes, subordinated to mercantile control, authority divorced from the virile and the sacred. So in Britain, we have King Charles, who is a kind of marionette king, right? Nominally, he is the most powerful person in the country, the monarch, but really, he's not. He's pretty famous for protecting the facades of London's historic buildings, right? This is one of the most important things that King Charles has done, which is a worthy thing to do, I think, but also a fitting description of his role, right? He's an empty symbol, not a monarch, and so he protects these facades, whereas behind them, these buildings are gutted and probably filled up with NGOs, which do all sorts of things which are totally anti-traditional and anti-monarchical and filled with plastic furniture and so on and so forth. You know, he's able to sell some nice organic biscuits from his estate and support mercantile programs like climate change, whatever. Like, he's into that. But these are all examples of the king bending his monarchical will to the managed stasis of the merchants. Then we have the Archbishop, Justin Welby, a pretty tragic figure, you know, a pretty sinister figure as well, I think, who seems to me his entire career was building up to him resigning in a kind of martyrdom to damage the church. But that is his role. He's subordinate to the merchants. And so his job is to reframe Christian doctrine so that they conform to the present political environment, which is dictated by the technical experts, refugees, homosexuals, like whatever you think of these things. It's undeniable that the church, in order to retain any kind of position whatsoever within the structure, is forced to reframe its doctrine so that they fit the necessities of the modern world. He's an administrator, not a priest. And the warrior, or the soldier rather, General Sir Rupert Smith. I recently read his book, The Utility of Force, it's a very good book, very interesting. And he sort of does a von Clausewitz or a Sun Tzu. He goes through his philosophy of the use of force. And he talks about what the West should be doing militarily in the current political environment. He kind of, we've used the term fifth generation warfare is quite trendy at the moment. He has his own sort of version of this, what he comes up with. And he's trying to decide what we should do within this environment. And basically he says that unity of political and military command is unimaginable today. The realities of nuclear war mean that you just can't have military commanders making their own decisions. And he basically says that he needs international human rights lawyers and politicians to tell him what to do, which, you know, you might think that sounds a bit cringe or whatever, but within the confines that he sets up for himself and within the system of logic he sets up, it makes perfect sense. And ultimately he is a soldier, not a warrior. He's a functionary of mercantile power. So we have this hypertrophy at the lower levels, this idea coming again, like something that should have been held at the higher level explodes at the lower level. This induces the arrival of abominations such as the academic and knife crime, or the sorts of gangs that I referred to obliquely earlier on. These occupy the formerly sacred roles of priest and warrior. So the actual priests and warriors are subordinated to mercantile control, and they have this kind of symbolic role which upholds the power of the merchants. But you have, instead of actual priests, you have academics. They explain the world to us, but they also, in spite of their rationalistic mythology, give us an ethical framework as well. They're constantly telling us what we should do, right? In spite of the fact that they're supposed to be telling us what is the case, they're always telling us what ought to be the case. And then with the idea of knife crime, you have these kind of rogue regime client groups just doing exactly what they want. You know, if Lex Animata in Terris is not open to the warrior or to the artist today, who are all completely contained by the necessities of mercantile power, these regime client groups are just acting first, as you'd hope a warrior would do, acting without hesitation, doing exactly what they want and getting away with it. They occupy the formerly sacred roles of priest and warrior, but in this kind of deformed lower way, which is the result of the hypertrophy at the lower levels. And we, as I said before, we're writing things down, and this is a doomed attempt to maintain a permanent stasis directed by the technical experts, a belief that we have escaped the regressive themes of the past, fragile, timid behavior designed to contain real authority, but nature will have its say in the end. So yes, I mean, it's just insane to think that you can like write some laws down on a piece of paper and that this will prevent the natural cycles that have occurred over and over again throughout time from happening anymore. You know, the Goldilocks theory of mass extinction events being a perfect example of this. It's just mental. Okay, the modern condition, part 2, the dawn of the slave empire. As I said, Evola thinks we're at the point of transition between these as political authorities descending from the mercantile caste to the peasant caste. So what do we see? Standardization and atomization does not free us from oppressive structures. This is what happens at the lower levels. We come apart. We have more standardization, more uniformity, less individuation, less differentiation, and we have thus atomization, the structures collapsing, much like the complex geometric patterns in the sand drawn within an episode of Zen Gardening, shall we say. As it comes apart, we're left with just grains of sand. In fact, abolition mandates universal slavery, right? This is true. Like we think we've abolished slavery by writing some things down on a piece of paper, but actually what we've done is made everyone a slave. It's illegal not to be a slave. Anything higher than that has been destroyed by this descent of political authority down to the lowest possible level, subjugation to the most chaotic peripheral forces, subordination to a collective temporal body, cellular life, or yeast life, as another commentator calls it. Total surveillance in uniform digital spaces, dissociative, reflexive outrage at the current thing, the death of human interiority and privacy. Right, this totally online life, these surveillance cameras everywhere. Like, what is this apart from us being completely subsumed into this temporal body? You're constantly watched. Your information is constantly harvested and sent back to this kind of inhumane central processing vast machine, which then controls everything you do. We've arrived through the efforts of the technocrats. We've arrived at the final stage of the death of human interiority and privacy. It has been achieved. But as we said, this is chaotic and unstable. And Evola says this. This is encoded in the traditions he references, that as we go down, the cycles become tighter and tighter as things become more chaotic. This is the shortest part of the cycle. So we're worried about the idea that the technocrats are going to create this permanent situation of control. But actually, Evola would say that's not true. We're going to have a very rapid reversal from this situation. Although he doesn't say, he discusses this slightly later on in one of the further essays, but will it be a sudden restoration of order, or will it be a progressive or restorative upward trend? We don't know yet. Denial of the social quadripartition dooms the egalitarian utopia. The final act of decadence initiates the return to the beginning of the cycle, the revolution. So in traditional language, the revolution has a different meaning. It's not a sort of one-off millenarian utopian event. The revolution that brings us something new, that escapes the cycle. The revolution in traditional terms brings us back to the beginning. So today we have fragmented residues of power. I think there's a lot of interesting discussions of power going on today as we live in this kind of atomized, fractious environment. That you see the peasant who's subject to chaotic, overwhelming forces. He thinks that someone must be in charge, right? And there are all these kind of terrible things happening to him. There must be some malign conspiracy occurring, which is resulting in these terrible events. And so you can see why the peasant is attracted to the conspiracy frame. It makes sense from the perspective of the kind of the spirit of the peasant, that these kind of conspiratorial, shall we say, like slightly less sophisticated and fantastical ideas of power are a natural outcome of his station in life. For the merchant, who's an anonymous node in a technical system, the merchant, the sort of bourgeois merchant, is likely to prefer the idea of an emergent phenomena, the network consensus. The merchant just sits as a node, a sort of anonymous node in a network, and watches vital exchanges, energy exchanges flow through him. So you can see why he'd be attracted to the idea of emergent phenomena as his explanation of power. And you'll sometimes get the idea that power is directed upwards from the bottom, from the technical experts. But this is insane, because we're talking about the most atomized and disorganized elements being able to dictate the terms of sort of history of political power, whereas actually it is the most organized which dictate the terms of history. So this idea of power up from the bottom, I think it's really just a technique of control used by the merchants, which is designed in the short term to keep the peasants in line without an appeal to actual authority. The warrior, who is a self-directed individual bound by temporal realism, right? Top-down power is the way the warrior sees the world. So you can see why the warrior spirit sort of is attracted to elite theory as their kind of understanding of the way things are happening. The priest sees power as mystical and abstract, something not to be touched by human hands. Again, you have this kind of appeal to, to something outside of the situation we find ourselves in from the more priestly characters. That's their definition of power. Just wait for, God will eventually sort it out, right? We just need to take our hands off and be good. But ultimately, Evola would say that all of these people yearn for integration through the appearance of a true monarch who can focus power upwards. And if we look at the modern environment, I think this is true. I think people want this, right? Ultimately, I think Evola's right on this. But the circumstances we find ourselves in the moment, we are in a downward process of decay. And ultimately, this desire is obstructed by mainstream liberals and conservatives who protect the involutive process as bourgeois priests of decay. Again, this is something that Schmitt says, that the liberal is he who won't take his own side in a conflict and so goes to war with the idea of the political itself. He wants to live a life free from political risk, the dream of the liberal. And this ultimately manifests in him preventing anyone from trying to use power below him or to try and recruit him to use power properly. He just ends up supporting the status quo. And the conservatives, they tend to be more of this kind of priestly character. So they are just scared of using power and are kind of happy to lose slowly as long as they're making a few quid. This is a well-established phenomenon by now. Okay, well, thank you for listening. That was The Decline of the Idea of the State, the first essay from the Metaphysics of Power. So we will be back next time, when the next one's finished, to discuss On Philip the Fair.